Hello, welcome to Middle East in World Affairs, and now we are in class 7, which is we will talk about political chaos in Syria and Turkish foreign policy. So the hypothesis is similar to Iraq. Political chaos in Syria is not a contemporary phenomenon. Without focusing on problematic state formation, without focusing on internal and external dynamics, and particularly, of course, I am underlining this, the role of the external factors, and without focusing on religious, economic, and identity-related variables, then we cannot understand the problem in Syria. And what makes Syria is very interesting case, actually. Its anti-regime military campaign was the external involvement in the region, in the country, this time actually saved the regime rather than let the collapse of the regime. Because in Libya, for instance, we knew that Gaddafi regime is collapsed by the United States-led coalition. But on the other hand, Syria, this time, the external involvement, mainly the Russian and Iranian help, saved the Assad regime and probably will lead to its victory over the opposition. So when we look at the problematic state formation in Syria, we see that, first of all, the artificial boundaries. As I mentioned before, Syria was also an artificial country. It's left in the French area of influence during the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but the artificial boundaries and separation of Kurdish groups, Sunni Shia groups was lead to problem in the country. Then, of course, when you have the artificial boundaries, you definitely have the legitimacy problem, which is naturally come automatically. And then tribalism is also a big problem in Syria, because as we will see, the Alevi regime of, especially, Assad regime was dependent on Alevi rule, and religious sectarianism is one of the main reasons of war in Syria, because we know that Assad regime, in particularly, they keep the key position through its Alevi-based coalition. And the other problem in Syria was the legacy of military coups and use of force, because Syria was a very unstable country. As I mentioned in the previous classes, for example, it became part of the United Arab Republic between 58 and 61. Then the military coup took Syria out of the United Arab Republic. And then later on, we got all this legacy where the using of violence, resort to violence, become a normal mode of subjectivity like many other Arab countries. So if we make some conclusion, we can say that considering its already problems on demographical limits, ethnic-based Shiism, there's already profound problems in the Syria because of the legitimacy, because of the artificial border, because of the religious fights, religious Shiism, plus the extra problems like corruption and other related factors, in return caused a problem where Arab states emerge as weak, and Syria is not an exception, because Hafez Assad rule just temporarily cancel the problem, but it doesn't mean that it's completely sort out the problem. So when we look at the origins of the Syrian crisis, first of all, we see the correction movement and Hafez Assad era, 1970-2000. Without a doubt, Hafez Assad was a calculated policymaker, and he effectively ruled Syria for 30 years. And he came with the correction movement. Why we call it correction movement? Because Hafez Assad corrected some of the wrongdoing within the Syrian policy. So for Hafez Assad, he always make a calculative moves rather than emotional moves. So, for example, one of the things is that before Assad, Syria was always giving support to Palestinian case, and they also even support the Palestinians in Jordan, which is called Black September era in 1970. And Assad, when he got the power through military coup, the first thing he did is he withdrew Syrian support to Palestinians and instead supported Jordan government, Hashemite government. So he tried to correct the things, because for Assad to support the legal regimes, to support the regimes over the people, were more important for Syrian national interest. So that was the calculated policy of him. We can see in manywhere, and also in Lebanon, where once more in Lebanon, it was the Assad contribution, Assad involvement that stopped the Palestinians from their ultimate victory. So although you are expecting any Arab leader to support Palestinian cause, for example, in Assad case, it was different. He tried to make calculative steps, and mainly he was against the Palestinian state in Jordan or in Lebanon. So he made these moves and grasped the control. Secondly, we see that the Arab Spring is why it happened in Syria. That was actually the question should be asked, because we see that during the wars, we see that only two regimes in the Middle East was actually anti-Western. One of them was Gaddafi Libya, and the other one is Assad regime in Syria. So when the Gaddafi has been moved from the power, then the next turn was Syria. So what I'm basically trying to say is that Arab Spring intentionally canalized to two anti-Western regime in the region. And after the success in Libya, the Western powers think that they can be successfully dismantle the Assad regime in Syria. And then we see that there has been external interruptions, like the Kurdish, the American help to the Kurdish military groups, and the Western help. And also we got that Sunni regimes, radical Sunni regimes is also supported the radical ISIS and other Al-Qaeda related groups. So all these factors lead to the point that we come to the point where the old rivalries based on Kurdish Arab and based on Sunni Shia fight is realived in the context of Syria. So let's move to the second point, because there was a fight in the Turkish neighborhood in Syria, and in that respect, unfortunately, we see that Turkish foreign policy have been failed in Syria. So now we will analyze this point, because as I said, Turkish foreign policy in Syria was like one step forward, two steps back, and many mistakes have been made regarding to Turkish foreign policy in Syria. The first point is we should underline this miscalculation of the Assad regime, because Assad was a very friend of AKP, friend of President Erdogan, but later on he became the main enemy of Turkish regime. And there was a miscalculation, because Assad thought that he doesn't have broader base, he doesn't have a support, so Assad could be easily removed from the power and it will collapse easily. So this was the main miscalculation of the Turkish policymakers, because in fact Assad regime didn't go easily. Assad actually have a strong base, and Assad also, as the war extended, he also started to have more base, even from the Sunni groups. So this was the thing that couldn't be calculated by the Turkish foreign policymakers. Secondly, the Turkish foreign policymakers miscalculated that there will be a huge external support to Assad. So even Assad, let's say, get weaker position, get lost, or lost the power, Turkish policymakers couldn't calculate that Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah, and even Russia will give such a huge support to Assad regime. All these countries has a strong reasons of supporting the Assad regime, because first of all, Iran and Iraq are Shia countries, and Assad has Shia connection. Assad, as I said before in the previous weeks, Assad was the only leader who supported the Iran against the Iraq. So this Shia crescent, we can name it, the Shia people, from their own perception, they can only trust to Shia regimes. So they knew that if the Shia regime in Syria collapse, maybe the Iraq and the Iran even could be the next target, like a domino effect. So they have to stop the intervention of the foreign intervention in Syria. So that's why they support. Russia has also, it says, own reasons to support Assad regime. First of all, there's a huge military alliance, military sellings of Russian weapons to Syria. This is from the Hafez Assad era. It comes from the Hafez Assad era. Secondly, Russians' biggest ambition, which is to be in the hot seas, has been fulfilled by giving off bases to Assad, in giving bases to Russians in Mediterranean Sea. So that was the second reason, because the Russians may not secure such a base if there's a, let's say, Sunni-based regime in the country. So, and also the Russians do not want any Islamic terrorism, Islamic revival in Syria, because Russia has a strong Muslim population living in Russia. So they want to contain the radical Islamist group in Syria. So all these factors couldn't be understood, couldn't be analyzed by the Turkish foreign policymakers, and as a result, this caused a huge cost to Turkish foreign policymaker. One other mistake was overconfidence of the opposition to the Free Syrian Army, because Turkey think that Free Syrian Army is composed by professional fighters, but indeed there was an overconfidence, and it later on turned out that this Free Syrian Army was not that strong, and that was one of the another mistake that Turkish foreign policymakers made. One other problem was they underestimate the refugee problem of Syria, because Turkish policymakers thought that the Assad should go. Assad is a brutal leader, but on the other hand, they didn't calculate what will be the cost of war in Syria to Turkey. So the dimension of the war never calculated, the cost of the war never calculated, and we know that especially the refugees that come to Turkey is, nobody knows the exact number, but approximate numbers is between 4 million and maybe 3.5 million. So there's a huge number of refugees in Turkey. Definitely more than 4 million, most probably. So all these people, also economically speaking and socially speaking, brought some problems to the Turkish society. We see fights in many where the Syrian people did not successfully integrate into Turkish society. And also the cost of the refugees is more than $100 billion. So the AKP policymakers never calculated the dimension, cost, and implications of the refugee problem. One other mistake was they thought that there will be a new regime after the removal of the Assad, but they never calculated that what will be this new regime look like. Because we see that the alternatives of Assad is actually more dangerous to Turkey than Assad itself. Because Assad and Turkey has, comparatively speaking, good relations until recently. But on the other hand, when we look at the alternatives of the Assad, we see that Turkey's new neighbors, namely PKK, PYD, and ISIS, are more dangerous, much more dangerous than Assad regime and Assad may possess. So this was all big miscalculations, big problems. And one other problem was that, again, Turkish foreign policy makers failed to calculate that in the collapse of the Assad regime and in this vacuum, political vacuum, could be fulfilled by Iran, and Iran could become a more strong power base in the Middle East, which, although Turkey and Iran doesn't have a bad relationship, Turkey, on the other hand, never want Iran to be a regional hegemony on its borders. So that was another miscalculation by Turkish foreign policymakers. One of the one of the big problem of Turkish foreign policy makers was also Kurdish dilemma. What I mean by this, you know that there's a considerable Kurds living in Turkey, and on one hand, when the separatist PKK is fighting for independence, then you know, the Turkish forces, you know, effectively fight with PKK terrorists and try to keep the integrity of Turkey. But on the other hand, we see that by not respecting Assad territorial integrity, Turkey is clash with itself, because not allowing or not giving any autonomy to the Kurdish in Turkey, but on the other hand, endangering Assad regime, and by this way inevitably allowing a Kurdish state in Syria, was the two problematic points where Turkish foreign policymakers also failed to calculate. So to sum up, we see that what is mostly neglected in Syrian problem is the problematic Arab state, its profound limits since its existence, and unfortunately, it seems no easy solution in Syrian crisis. The war still ongoing after all these years, and while the problem is very heated and problematic, Turkish foreign policymakers miscalculated the Syrian crisis in many respects, and we know that any solution excluding Shias and also broader Shia states' sensitiveness in the region and the Russian interest cannot bring any sustainable solution in Syria. So it's not just a matter of Assad regime or 10%, 12% Shia rule over the Sunni majority. Actually, Syria, as I said, is just a very important point for the all Shia population in the region, all Shia countries in the region. They see it as a domino effect, so they don't want Assad regime to collapse, and Turkish foreign policymakers could not calculate this, and because of this, Turkey pay a high cost of this miscalculation. Yes, thank you for listening. We will continue with lecture 8.